In December 2004, a 2-year-old boy wandered only a short distance to buy candy and disappeared along a route his family could see from their door. There were neighbors nearby, children playing, cars moving slowly through the lot. Yet no one witnessed what happened in the span of a few silent minutes. And still, he vanished without a trace. How can a child disappear in the very center of ordinary life? East Portland was a place caught between the worn-out weight of old motels and the steady hum of people trying to survive another year. Families moved in and out of the aging court-style housing that lined the side streets, and those who stayed longer tended to know one another only by habit, not by closeness. Among the residents was the Walker family, Emma, her husband Jack, their 7-year-old son Samuel, and the youngest, a round-cheeked toddler named Charlie, whom most neighbors knew simply as Little Charlie. They lived in a small ground-floor room at the far end of the motel courtyard, a space filled with the constant clatter of Jack's tools, leftover cardboard from his recycling work, and Charlie's toys arranged in a way that only a 2-year-old would understand. Emma, born in 1976, in a quiet town farther south, had grown used to the rhythm of long shifts and modest pay, and though her life rarely allowed rest, she carried herself with a patience that made her seem steadier than the world around her. Jack, rougher around the edges but dependable in the ways that counted, spent most days driving an old Ford pickup through alleys and back roads, picking up scrap metal for a few dollars at a time. For them, the days were simple and repetitive, stitched together by work, worry, and the hope of giving their boys a better childhood than they had known. In those weeks before Christmas, the motel courtyard was full of noise, children running in circles, holiday music leaking from open windows, and neighbors dragging boxes of decorations across cracked pavement. Charlie was at the age where every sound caught his attention, and he followed the older kids with a mix of admiration and stubborn independence. He liked to toddle after Samuel, even when his little legs could barely keep up. And every afternoon he waited for the moment Emma and Jack paused from sorting cans or stacking cardboard so he could run out and join the other children in the courtyard. A few weeks earlier, a man named Travis Moore had begun lingering around the motel. He lived in a weathered trailer behind the property, kept mostly to himself, and seemed to drift between odd jobs. At first, no one thought much of him, but he had a way of appearing wherever the children gathered, especially near Charlie. More than once he told Jack that he found the little boy adorable and joked about adopting him. Emma did not find the comment amusing. Something about the way Travis watched Charlie made her uneasy. Jack brushed the man off, telling him there was nothing to discuss. But the unease lingered, and Emma kept it to herself, unsure whether her worry was justified or just another fear added to the many she already carried. On the afternoon of December 23rd, the sky hung low with clouds, thick and unmoving, as if the city were waiting for snow that never came. Emma was sitting near the doorway with 2 neighbors, sharing a brief moment of rest while Jack lay inside trying to recover from a cold. The boys in the courtyard were chasing one another around the parking spaces, and Charlie, as usual, ran behind them, laughing in his unsteady toddler way. The air smelled faintly of gasoline from cars passing on the main road, mixed with the sharper scent of winter pine from a nearby tree lot. For a while, everything felt entirely ordinary. At around 20 minutes to 4, Charlie came running toward Emma, his cheeks flushed, his hands still sticky from playing outside. He tugged at her sleeve, asking for 2 quarters so he could buy candy from the convenience store at the corner. It was a place they knew well, barely 200 meters away, visible from the edge of the courtyard if one leaned far enough. Emma hesitated only a moment, then reached into her pocket and handed him the coins, reminding him to come straight back. Charlie nodded in the enthusiastic way children do when they understand only the part they want to hear. And he turned, clutching the money in his fist, and hurried off toward the sidewalk. 30 minutes passed. The group of children gradually returned, one by one, their energy fading as the cold crept in. But Charlie was not among them. At first, Emma assumed he had stopped to look at something along the way, or gotten distracted by decorations in the store, small things that often delayed him. But a faint feeling of wrongness began to build when the minutes kept stretching longer. She asked the older kids whether they had seen him. A little girl shook her head, and a boy around 5 years old said he saw a man on a motorcycle calling Charlie over near the parking lot exit. The child's memory was unclear, but the image was unsettling enough to make Emma stand abruptly to her feet. She walked quickly toward the corner store, calling Charlie's name, scanning the sidewalk, the small aisles inside the shop, and the row of houses behind it. She checked the ditch where the sidewalk dipped, then the bus stop across the street, her mind jumping from possibility to possibility without settling on any of them. When nothing turned up, she circled back, this time running, hoping perhaps she had simply missed him the first time. By now Jack had come outside, alerted by a neighbor, and the two of them began searching in opposite directions, their voices rising louder than the everyday noise of the area. As the sky dimmed and the holiday lights in the motel courtyard flickered on, the discomfort grew into something heavier. There was no sign of Charlie on the main road, no sign in the alleys. No, tiny footprints leading toward the wooded lot behind the trailer homes. The man on the motorcycle mentioned by the child could not be identified. The boy could not describe him, could not say where he went, could not recall anything except the sound of the engine. The store clerk had not seen a small boy with coins in his hand. No neighbor remembered anything unusual. By early evening, Emma and Jack had covered every direction they could think of, calling, searching, asking questions that no one could answer. The sounds of children playing had long faded, replaced by the distant hum of cars heading home for the night. In a place full of people living close together, in a courtyard where someone always seemed to be watching or listening, a 2-year-old boy had disappeared, as if pulled silently out of the world. And from that cold December afternoon onward, no one would see little Charlie Walker again. When the Walkers finally called 911 that evening, the dispatcher transferred the case to the East Precinct of Portland Police, where missing child calls were not uncommon, but rarely involved children as young as Charlie. Within minutes, officers arrived at the motel courtyard, their patrol lights casting slow red and blue waves across the thin December fog. Emma stood near the doorway, arms crossed tightly against her chest, speaking in short, careful sentences as she tried to recount the last time she had seen her son. Jack moved in and out of the conversation, unable to stay still, answering questions only halfway before pacing off again toward the edge of the property, as if hoping Charlie might appear if he looked from just the right angle. The officers began by checking the immediate surroundings. They searched the convenience store, the dumpster area, the narrow walkway behind the motel, and the nearby bus stop. They spoke with the store clerk, who could not recall a toddler entering that afternoon. They questioned the older children who had played in the courtyard, but their memories were scattered, clouded by the excitement of the day and the limits of their age. The 5-year-old boy, the only one who mentioned the man on the motorcycle, could not describe his face, his height, or the color of the bike. It was a thin thread to follow, but in the early hours of a missing child case, thin threads were often the only ones available. Because it was already past 4 hours since the child's disappearance, officers recommended initiating an Amber Alert, though the system in 2004 was still limited and required certain criteria that were not immediately clear. There was no description of the abductor beyond a vague reference from a child, no license plate, no confirmed sighting. Even so, given the boy's age and the rapidly cooling night, supervisors approved the alert, and soon the state system broadcast a brief notice. A 2-year-old boy, likely abducted, last seen near the motel complexes off the main road. To Emma, the flashing message on the high television inside a neighbor's room felt both urgent and distant. It was difficult for her to grasp that her son's face, one she had wiped clean each morning and kissed goodnight each evening, was now part of a public warning sent across Oregon. She answered the detective's questions again, describing Charlie's clothes, his mannerisms, his short attention span, and the way he held his left hand when he ran. She told them about Travis Moore, the man who had once asked about adopting her son. The officers noted the name immediately. 2 detectives visited the trailer where Travis lived. He claimed he had been working his shift at a repair shop across town all afternoon. Surveillance footage from the shop's parking lot showed his vehicle arriving just before 4 and leaving after 8. His co-workers confirmed his presence. With that, the initial suspicion moved away from him, though his earlier interest in Charlie remained in the case notes. As the night deepened, more officers arrived to help with the ground search. They swept the wooded lot behind the trailer park with flashlights, their beams bending around tree trunks and picking up the pale gleam of frost. A K9 unit was brought in, but search dogs could not track a scent in the maze of overlapping smells from cars, garbage bins, and dozens of residents moving around the area. Officers expanded the search radius to several blocks, checking abandoned structures and culverts. Nothing brought them closer to understanding where Charlie had gone. By early morning, the motel courtyard had returned to a strange stillness, the kind that comes when a place has been stirred too much, too quickly. Neighbors gathered quietly, some offering coffee, others recounting small observations that led nowhere. A few thought they had heard a motorcycle earlier in the afternoon, but in that neighborhood the sound was common, one noise among many. The detectives continued interviewing residents, trying to form a timeline. One neighbor said Charlie had been playing near the parking lot entrance for several minutes before he left for the store. Another reported seeing a man wearing a dark jacket near the same entrance, though she could not say whether he had interacted with the boy. The convenience store owner showed his sales logs, proving that no candy had been purchased during the time Charlie was expected to be there. This meant the child never reached the store, narrowing the window of time to only a few minutes between leaving the courtyard and disappearing. As the hours progressed with no developments, officers shifted from a hopeful search to a more structured investigation, though they kept the tone gentle when speaking with Emma and Jack. They explained how abductions sometimes occurred quickly, in ways the human eye struggled to register, especially in areas with many moving people. They asked about the family's routine, whether anyone might hold resentment toward them, whether Charlie had ever wandered off before. Emma answered each question steadily, trying to remain clear despite her exhaustion, often glancing towards the parking lot as if expecting to see a small figure running toward her. By the end of the second day, the investigative team mapped out every known route in and out of the area, roads leading to the interstate, smaller residential lanes, and the access point behind the motel where a motorcycle could exit without being seen. They requested traffic camera footage from the nearest highways, though in 2004, such systems covered only limited stretches. None of the available recordings captured a man with a young child. The Amber Alert brought in several calls from around the region, but none were reliable. A woman claimed she saw a toddler at a rest stop off I-84, but the description did not match. A man reported a child crying in a pickup truck at a gas station, but the vehicle left before police arrived, and later footage revealed the child belonged to a different family. Each false lead drained energy and time from the officers, yet they pursued everyone, hoping that the next call might reveal something useful. Meanwhile, Emma and Jack began a desperate search of their own. They approached nearby businesses, taped missing posters to traffic poles, and drove along county roads where abandoned barns or storage units might hide something out of view. Emma clutched a photograph of Charlie in his overalls, showing it to anyone willing to look for more than a passing second. The image, taken just weeks before, seemed already too distant, as if it belonged to another life. By the end of the third day, the detectives acknowledged privately that the case was shifting from an active search to an uncertain investigation. Emma did not yet understand the weight of those words, but she sensed the change in tone. The way officers now spoke more slowly, the way they paused before answering Jack's questions, the way no one used the word soon anymore. The motel courtyard, once full of movement, now felt hollow, as though a piece of it had been taken away and the emptiness had settled into the walls. In those first quiet days after the search began, there was still a thin hope that Charlie might be found nearby, perhaps abandoned or discovered by someone who did not yet know about the alert. But as the sky shifted from gray to a pale winter blue and still no sign appeared, the truth settled in more firmly. Something deliberate had happened that afternoon, something that no one had witnessed clearly enough to stop. The investigation would continue, but the path forward was no longer straight, and every day without answers made it harder to imagine that the boy might be returned quickly. The case was no longer just a missing child report. It was the beginning of a story no one yet knew how to finish. In the months that followed, the case of Charlie Walker shifted quietly from the urgency of nightly patrols and doorstep interviews to the slower cadence of a file moved between desks, revisited only when a new tip surfaced. The motel courtyard returned gradually to its usual routine, though for Emma and Jack nothing felt familiar anymore. They continued living in the same room, but the space seemed altered, as if the absence of their youngest son had hollowed it out from the inside. Charlie's small shoes remained by the door for weeks, then months, because Emma could not bring herself to move them, fearing that putting them away would confirm the fear she refused to speak aloud. Detectives from the Missing Persons Unit stopped by every few weeks at first, updating the parents on the handful of leads that continued to trickle in. Most of these came from people who believed they had seen a child matching Charlie's description somewhere in Oregon or Washington, but none of the sightings led to anything more than short conversations and routine checks. One report described a toddler crying in the back seat of a sedan in a grocery store parking lot. Another came from a traveler who believed she had seen a boy on the shoulder of a rural road. Each call brought a flicker of hope that faded quickly once officers confirmed that the children involved were not Charlie. By late 2005, nearly a year after the disappearance, the case file grew thinner in activity, even as it grew thicker with paperwork. One of the detectives, a man named Carter, who had been a steady presence since the first night, sat with Emma at the motel picnic table and explained that missing child investigations could slow for long periods, especially when there were no new witnesses, no physical traces, and no evidence of voluntary disappearance. He chose his words with care, avoiding the heavy phrases that might cause her to break. But Emma understood what he meant. The police had searched everywhere they could, and without new information, the momentum had reached its natural end. The case would remain open, but it would now fall under the category they called cold, a term meant to describe the state of the investigation rather than the child, though Emma felt the temperature of those words settle deep inside her. As time moved on, the strain on the Walkers' marriage grew more visible. Jack blamed himself for allowing Charlie to play unsupervised that afternoon, and Emma blamed herself for giving him the coins and letting him walk to the store alone. Neither accusation was spoken aloud, but the weight of those private regrets pressed heavily on both of them. Conversations became shorter, often trailing into silence. Meals were eaten quickly or skipped entirely, and nights were restless, each parent waiting for the other to suggest what they both feared might be true: that they were losing their grasp on their family one day at a time. Samuel, older and more aware, felt the shift too. He grew quieter, spending more time alone, drawing shapes in the dirt behind the motel or sitting near the pool window watching cars pass. Sometimes he asked whether Charlie might come back on a day they did not expect. Emma always answered yes, though her voice grew softer as the months stretched longer. She found herself studying Samuel's face at night, trying to memorize him, afraid that something might happen to him too. She walked him to school, even when he insisted he could go alone, waited outside until the final bell, often without explanation, and kept him in the same room with her whenever possible. In 2007, after 3 years of searching without progress, the Walkers finally left the motel. The memories tied to that place had grown too heavy, and they hoped that a change of environment might offer a chance to rebuild. They rented a small duplex farther south in Salem, closer to Emma's older sister, who tried gently to create a sense of routine for the family. But the move did little to repair what had already been worn thin. Jack continued working as a scrap hauler, driving longer hours and speaking less. Emma took a job cleaning offices at night, which kept her busy but deepened the quiet hours when she thought most about the case. The detective still called occasionally, once after a child was found abandoned in a county park, another time when a neighbor in Portland claimed to have overheard a man bragging about taking a boy years earlier. But each lead faded quickly. Then, in the summer of 2009, tragedy struck again. Samuel drowned in a lake near Silverton while on an outing with his cousins. The authorities ruled it an accident, a sudden slip from a shallow bank into colder, deeper water. But for Emma, the incident pulled her into a grief so complete that it seemed to dissolve whatever remained of her strength. Friends and family tried to comfort her, reminding her that accidents happen. But Emma could not separate Samuel's death from the loss of Charlie. It felt as if the world had taken both her sons in ways she could not understand or control. Jack withdrew further, unable to carry Emma's grief alongside his own, and for a time it seemed their family might not survive the weight placed upon it. In the months after Samuel's passing, Emma stopped calling the Portland detectives as often. It was not because she had given up, but because she no longer had the energy to relive the details with each new officer assigned to the case. Sometimes she imagined Charlie returning as a teenager, knocking on the door without warning, asking why she had not found him sooner. Other times she imagined him living somewhere else entirely, unaware of who he was or where he had come from. These thoughts pressed her between hope and despair until she felt suspended, unable to move in either direction. Yet despite the heaviness, a thin strand of purpose remained. Emma submitted her DNA to the National Database for Missing Children and Biological Relatives. She clipped every article she found about unidentified boys recovered in other states. She wrote letters to child advocacy groups, asking for help even when they had nothing to offer beyond sympathy. And every December, without fail, she bought a small toy and placed it in a box she kept on her closet shelf. A habit not meant for anyone else to see, but a quiet way of keeping the memory of her son alive. By the early 2010s, the case had settled fully into silence. Technology advanced, but unless a new sample or suspect appeared, there was nothing for police to test. Personnel changed, detectives retired or moved to other units, and the file traveled from one storage shelf to another. Yet Emma carried the story with her through each year of labor, loss, and quiet endurance. She never stopped believing that somewhere Charlie was still alive, even if she could no longer imagine the details of his life. And though she rarely said it aloud, she continued to live with a single unspoken promise, that if the day ever came when her son reached out, she would be there, ready to recognize him, no matter how much time had passed. Nearly 20 years had passed since the afternoon Charlie Walker disappeared, and the case had long settled into the quiet corner of the Oregon State Police archives, where old files rested in cardboard boxes marked with dates and case numbers rather than expectations. Emma, now living in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Salem, had built a routine that left little room for hope, yet still made space for it in small, private ways. She continued her overnight shifts with the city sanitation crew, waking early each afternoon to tend the few responsibilities she still held close. Though the years had weathered her face, her posture retained the subtle alertness of someone who had never stopped listening for a voice that should have grown deeper over time. For her, the passing years did not diminish the possibility that Charlie was alive. They only made it harder to imagine where he might be. In early March of 2024, while Emma worked her usual shift, a development began unfolding hundreds of miles away in Colorado, inside the secure, echoing walls of a state penitentiary. A man named Riley Boone, once the central figure in a multi-state child trafficking operation, had been incarcerated for nearly a decade. Boone had a reputation among investigators as someone who understood the inner workings of illegal networks better than most, but until recently, he had shown no willingness to cooperate with authorities. Now, facing the prospect of dying in prison, he had instructed his attorney to approach federal agents with an offer. He claimed he possessed information about several unsolved abduction cases from the early 2000s, cases that had never been connected to him because of gaps in record-keeping and the chaotic nature of the criminal circles he once moved through. At first, federal investigators doubted the value of his claims. Boone had a pattern of manipulating situations to his advantage, and his sudden interest in cooperation raised predictable skepticism. Yet, when he began recounting the details of a case involving a small boy taken from a low-income motel complex in Oregon during the holiday season of 2004, the description struck a chord with an agent who had once assisted Oregon authorities on a related investigation. Boone described the motel layout, the location of the bodega the child was supposedly heading to, the cold weather that afternoon, and the brief window during which the abduction occurred. His details were not perfect, but they were too close to the known facts to be coincidence. The agent, cautious but attentive, requested clarification, and Boone went on to explain that he was not the one who physically took the boy. Instead, the abduction had been carried out by a man named Derek Miles, a transient figure who drifted between odd jobs across the Northwest. According to Boone, Miles owed him money at the time and had offered to pay the debt by delivering a child to contacts in Idaho who were willing to buy infants and toddlers. Boone claimed he had advised against such a risky operation, but Miles insisted. Boone said he had no direct involvement, but he knew of the incident because Miles told him afterward, bragging that the abduction had taken less than 15 seconds. The agent listening to Boone's account requested that the prison interview be recorded and notified the Oregon State Police. Within days, a small team began cross-checking Boone's statements with archived records from 2004. They pulled the Walker file from storage, scanned its contents into a digital system, and compared every detail Boone mentioned: geography, time frame, possible accomplices, method of transport. The match was not perfect, but it was close enough to justify reopening the investigation. When the team reviewed records from Idaho's adoption and child placement databases, they found a small number of irregularities from the mid-2000s. Children adopted privately with incomplete documentation, birth certificates reissued under unclear circumstances, and guardianship records that did not fully align with state regulations of that era. Among those irregularities was the file of a young man named Caleb Ross, adopted as a toddler in early 2005 by a couple living outside Boise. Much of the adoption paperwork appeared legitimate, but several supporting documents were missing, and the agency listed as the intermediary had since dissolved due to licensing violations. The inconsistencies alone were not sufficient to prove anything, But when investigators compared Caleb's age and general appearance to the photographs of Charlie in the old Walker case file, they saw a resemblance striking enough to warrant further review. The next step required discretion. Investigators sought a court order allowing them to obtain a DNA sample without alerting the young man or his adoptive family. By chance, Caleb was enrolled at Boise State University and had recently undergone routine blood work at the campus health clinic, making the process straightforward. The sample was collected legally, transferred to a federal lab, and tested against the DNA Emma had voluntarily submitted years earlier. The match was almost immediate. The lab confirmed a 99.98% probability of maternity, leaving no room for interpretation. For the first time in 20 years, investigators had something definitive, proof not only that Charlie was alive, but that he had been living in Idaho under a different identity for nearly his entire life. Yet even with this breakthrough, the authorities exercised caution. They needed to verify Boone's claims further, examine the adoptive parents' involvement, and ensure they approached Emma at the right moment. The investigators coordinated with the Oregon and Idaho State Police, the FBI, and prosecutors in Colorado, forming a cross-state effort that moved deliberately, wanting to avoid errors after so many years of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Emma continued her routine, unaware that the answers she had spent 2 decades searching for were beginning to take shape. She still carried her phone in her pocket during work, even though it was usually silent. She still checked the missing children registry every few weeks, out of habit more than expectation. She still kept the small box on her closet shelf, where she stored tiny reminders of the toddler she once chased across a courtyard. Nothing in her daily life suggested that change was approaching. Yet in Colorado, Idaho, and Oregon, a chain of decisions and discoveries had already placed her on the threshold of a moment she had imagined and feared in equal measure. Before investigators contacted her, they wanted to confirm one last detail: whether Caleb had begun suspecting the truth on his own. It turned out he had. In the week before the DNA match was finalized, he had searched online databases for missing children and found an old photograph of a boy who looked too much like him to ignore. The discovery had unsettled him deeply, and though he had not yet reached out to anyone, the questions forming in his mind were already loosening the first threads of the story that would soon unravel. With all pieces confirming the same direction, investigators prepared to notify Emma Walker, knowing the call they would place in the coming days would reopen 20 years of memories, some painful, some hopeful, but all tied to the same December afternoon when her youngest son walked toward a convenience store and never returned. The call that would change the course of Emma Walker's life came in the early hours of April, at a time when most people slept through the quietest part of night. But Emma was just settling into rest after her shift. Her phone vibrated once, then again, and she hesitated when she saw the unfamiliar number. Over the years, she had learned that unexpected calls rarely brought comfort. Still, something compelled her to answer. Und tu, the other end was a young man's voice, steady at first, then uneven, as if he were unsure whether he should continue. He asked a simple question, one that seemed too heavy to fit into a single breath. "Ma'am, did you lose a son about 20 years ago?" Emma sat up quickly, her exhaustion evaporating. The boy continued with halting phrases, explaining that he had seen her name in an online registry of parents searching for missing children. He apologized repeatedly for waking her and admitted he might be wrong, but he felt she needed to hear from him. Emma asked him to send a photograph. When the image arrived, she studied the young man's face, her thumb trembling on the screen. The curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the faint dimple near the corner of his mouth. Features she had once traced with her hand in the quiet of early mornings, were present in a face now nearly grown. Though time had given him new angles and shadows, the familiarity struck her without warning. It was not certainty, not yet, but it was close enough that her breath caught before she managed a reply. Within hours, detectives confirmed what Emma already suspected. They arranged to meet her in person later that day, and when they arrived, they spoke with a measured calm, the way officers do when delivering news both delicate and monumental. They explained that the young man who had contacted her, now known as Caleb Ross, had been matched through DNA testing as her biological son. They told her he lived in Idaho, that he had grown up in a stable household, that he had never been harmed physically, and that he had begun questioning his origins only recently. They assured her she would be given the chance to meet him, but they needed to prepare the next steps carefully, as his adoptive parents still had to be interviewed, and additional information needed to be verified in the reopened case. Emma listened without interrupting. For years, she had practiced imagining what the truth would sound like, rehearsing the possible versions in her mind. Yet now that the truth was in front of her, she found herself sitting very still, as if any sudden movement might cause the moment to break. By the next morning, she was on a flight to Salt Lake City, traveling with 2 investigators who had been assigned to oversee the reunion. The hours felt long, not because of the distance, but because of the quiet thoughts that filled the space between her and the window. She wondered whether Charlie, Caleb, would recognize anything in her face. She wondered whether he had been happy, and whether that happiness had included room for questions he had been too afraid to ask. She imagined what he had been told about his beginnings and how those stories had shaped his view of the world. Most of all, she wondered whether the years apart would erase the instinct mothers often describe, the ability to sense their child, no matter how much time has passed. She hoped it had not. Meanwhile, investigators briefed her on what they had learned from Caleb's interviews. He had grown up believing he had been adopted because his biological mother could not care for him. He said he had never doubted that explanation until he reached adolescence, when subtle inconsistencies in the story began to trouble him. His adoptive parents had rarely spoken about his early years, and he noticed at times that they responded cautiously when he asked questions about how he had come into their lives. Their silence was not accusatory, nor did it come from malice. Rather, it carried the uneasy tone of people who had once trusted the wrong assurances and chose afterward to leave the past untouched. Caleb had stopped asking, but the questions never fully faded. What had changed recently was something small but consequential. He had discovered his original birth date was earlier than the one listed on his documents. The discrepancy was slight, but it unsettled him enough to search online for children who had gone missing around the same time he was born. That search led him to an image of a toddler in denim overalls, smiling at something just outside the frame. He stared at the photograph for a long time, struck not by certainty, but by a soft, troubling familiarity. When he found Emma's name connected to the old case, he hesitated for several days before deciding to call. When the plane landed and Emma stepped into the airport, the investigators guided her through a quiet exit where Caleb was waiting with 2 local officers nearby. He stood still when he saw her, uncertain how to begin, unsure whether to approach slowly or take the first step forward. Emma noticed the nervous movement in his hands, the way his eyes lowered for a moment as though grounding himself. She walked toward him, stopping only when they were close enough to hear each other breathe. Neither spoke. Caleb searched her face, absorbing every line and detail, recognizing pieces of himself in a way he could not articulate. When Emma finally raised her hand and touched his cheek, the gesture was cautious but steady, and Caleb did not pull back. He whispered her name, not the one he had grown up hearing, but the one he had found in the missing child registry. And with that, the distance of 2 decades began to fold in on itself. In the hours that followed, investigators continued piecing together the rest of the truth. How Derek Miles had taken Charlie from the motel, how he had delivered him through Boone's contacts, how the adoptive family had unknowingly accepted a child who had been taken unlawfully. Each detail was reviewed, confirmed, and filed as part of the reopened case. Emma listened, absorbing the information piece by piece, but her focus remained on the young man beside her. She did not ask him to explain the years in between, nor did she question the path that had brought him to that moment. There would be time for such conversations eventually. For now, it was enough that they were standing in the same room, both carrying fragments of a story that neither could complete without the other. Everything that came next, the legal process, the accountability, the consequences of what had been done years earlier, would be handled in court. But the truth itself had already surfaced, and it stood before them. Charlie had been found, not as a small boy running toward a convenience store, but as a grown young man searching for the missing pieces of his identity. Emma had not known how or when she would hear the truth, but when it finally arrived, it carried the weight of both loss and recovery, woven together in a way that could not be separated. The investigation that followed Caleb's identification moved with a steadiness shaped by caution rather than speed. After 2 decades of silence, no one involved wanted to risk a misstep that might compromise the case as it entered the legal system. Federal and state prosecutors worked together to reconstruct the chain of events from 2004, using Boone's testimony, archival files, and the newly uncovered adoption trail. Though many of the people who lived near the motel back then had moved away, investigators revisited the location, retracing the route between the courtyard and the convenience store, standing at the same parking lot entrance where Charlie had last been seen. The changes in the neighborhood, renovated buildings, paved sidewalks, new tenants, could not erase the memory of what had happened there. And for the officers reviewing the case, the landscape seemed to hold a faint echo of the unanswered questions that had lingered for 20 years. By the summer of 2024, charges were formally filed against 5 individuals connected to the trafficking ring operated by Boone and his associates. The most central of them, Riley Boone and Derek Miles, faced federal charges that carried severe penalties, including life imprisonment and, in Miles's case, a reinstatement of the death-eligible offense due to his direct involvement in the abduction. The others, though playing lesser roles, were accused of aiding and facilitating illegal transfers of minors during the years the operation was active. For Emma, the legal terminology meant little. What she understood was that these were the people whose choices had kept her from her son for nearly half of her life. The first hearing took place in a federal courthouse in Denver, chosen for its jurisdiction over cases connected to Boone's earlier convictions. Emma attended not because she believed it would bring her closure, but because she felt a responsibility to be present for the truth that was about to be placed on record. She sat in the second row of the gallery, hands clasped gently in her lap, her posture still and attentive. Caleb sat beside her for part of the proceedings, though much of the time he was with officers and support staff who guided him through the unfamiliar legal process. He had insisted on attending, not out of anger, but out of a need to understand the shape of the past he had inherited without choosing it. Boone entered the courtroom in a restrained manner, older and thinner than the man who once moved easily through criminal circles. He avoided looking toward the gallery. His voice, when called to testify about his involvement, was calm and dispassionate, providing details with the detachment of someone describing a business transaction rather than a crime that had shaped the lives of others. He did not deny his actions. Instead, he explained them with a clarity that created an uneasy quiet in the room. He described how the network operated, how children were selected, how they were transported, how profits were distributed among the participants. When asked specifically about Charlie's case, Boone explained how Miles had taken the boy to settle a personal debt, delivering him to an intermediary who arranged for the illegal placement in Idaho. Boone acknowledged that he had not known what became of the child afterward, only that the transfer had been completed and the money exchanged. Derek Miles's testimony took a different shape. He entered the courtroom with a hardened expression, his shoulders set in defiance. He refused to speak at length, responding to questions with short, clipped answers. He denied having targeted Charlie specifically, denied lingering near the motel in the days before the abduction, and denied having used a young girl as bait. But his denials were hollow beside the accumulated evidence. Boone's testimony, the timeline reconstructed from old phone records, the statements of former associates who had already entered plea agreements, and the DNA match placing Charlie miles away from Oregon in a household connected, however indirectly, to the network Miles had helped feed. For Emma, the courtroom carried an atmosphere that felt neither like victory nor like grief. Instead, it felt like an accounting, a long overdue explanation of events she had spent years trying to imagine. She watched the men responsible for her son's disappearance without anger, though her silence was not forgiveness. It was something steadier, something shaped by endurance, and shaped by the weight of knowing that she had survived what they had done. When the attorneys discussed sentencing guidelines, life imprisonment without parole for Boone, death-ineligible life extension for Miles, and decade-long sentences for the remaining defendants, Emma simply listened. She had lived through 20 years of waiting. The length of their sentences could not return the years she had lost. Caleb watched the proceedings with a quiet focus that surprised even him. Hearing the details spoken aloud by strangers made the story of his early life feel distant and yet strangely tangible. He had grown up with no memory of the abduction, no recollection of the motel courtyard or the small hand he had once reached toward the convenience store entrance. The courtroom testimony filled in pieces he had never known he was missing, and though the information was unsettling, he understood it was necessary. He had once wondered why he always felt slightly out of place in his childhood home, why certain questions made his adoptive parents uneasy, why he sometimes sensed a tension in the way they explained his beginnings. Hearing the truth laid out so clearly gave shape to those feelings and allowed him to stand more firmly in the identity he was now discovering. When the final day of the hearing ended, the judge delivered a firm decision. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. Boone's life term remained unchanged. Miles received a life sentence with the possibility of additional review, but no parole. The others received lengthy federal sentences aligned with their roles in the operation. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a quiet that seemed to settle like dust. Emma lingered for a moment before stepping into the hallway, knowing that what remained was not the end of something but the beginning of a new kind of understanding. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, and the late summer sun guided them across the pavement. Caleb walked beside Emma, neither speaking at first. They did not discuss the men they had seen or the testimony they had heard. Instead, they discussed where they would go next, how they would navigate the days ahead, and how they would begin shaping the kind of connection that had been delayed for so long. For Emma, the trial had provided a form of justice, but it was this quiet walk alongside her son that felt like the deeper measure of restoration. She had once thought that confronting the past would bring peace, but now she understood that peace was not something arrived at suddenly. It was something formed slowly, step by step, in the presence of the person she had never stopped waiting for. In the months following the trial, life for Emma and Caleb settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, yet steady, as though both were learning how to move again after standing still for 20 years. The court proceedings had closed an old chapter in the legal sense, but neither of them mistook the verdicts for an ending. What had been taken from them wasn't something a courtroom could return. Instead, they found themselves navigating the slow, often uneven process of understanding what remained and how it could be rebuilt. Caleb spent the first several weeks traveling back and forth between Idaho and Oregon, tending to the conversations that needed to occur with the adoptive family who had raised him. It was a complicated situation, shaped not by hostility, but by a quiet confusion that all three sides had to confront. His adoptive parents, who had believed they were offering stability to a child abandoned under unclear circumstances, were found by investigators to have had no knowledge of the illegal origins of the adoption. Their grief, once the truth surfaced, took the shape of guilt rather than defensiveness, as though they had unwittingly participated in a story they would never have chosen. Caleb reassured them that their years together did not dissolve with the discovery of his past. He explained that identity, for him, was no longer a single line pointing in one direction, but an intersection of lives that had shaped him in ways both seen and unseen. He asked for time rather than distance, and they respected that request, offering support as he stepped into this new part of his life. Emma, for her part, lived quietly in Salem, continuing the work that had grounded her through the hardest years. She did not speak often about the trial or the people involved. She rarely mentioned Boone or Miles, except when asked by detectives finishing the final portions of the case file. Instead, she focused on the small details of her days, sweeping the same streets she had walked for years, preparing simple meals, keeping her home tidy in a way that made space for new beginnings. There was no dramatic change in her habits, no sudden transformation, only a sense of stability returning one layer at a time, as if she was relearning how to inhabit a life that had long been overshadowed by the unknown. When Caleb visited, he stayed in the spare room she had kept empty for years. She had once imagined the room differently, filled with toys and school supplies and the belongings of a boy growing into adolescence. Now it held the few things Caleb brought with him: his laptop, his textbooks, a jacket he kept on the back of a chair. Emma did not decorate the room. She wanted him to decide what it should become. Some evenings they talked for hours, covering topics that had never before been shared between them: his interests, his plans for work after graduation, the small hesitations he still felt when trying to combine the two parts of his life into something whole. Other evenings they sat in silence, watching television or listening to the sound of traffic outside. It was a quiet, comfortable silence, the kind that grows only between people who do not need to explain their presence. As time went on, Caleb began to understand Emma not as a figure defined by tragedy, but as a woman who had endured years of uncertainty without allowing herself to collapse. He saw the careful way she organized her day, the patience she showed even when processing painful memories, and the steadiness with which she accepted the truth of what had happened. She did not deny the grief she carried, but neither did she allow it to shape every corner of her life. That balance, he realized, had been the anchor that kept her moving forward even when she believed she had no strength left. Emma, in turn, watched Caleb with the quiet pride of someone who had waited half her life to witness her child's adulthood. She did not try to reclaim the years lost. She did not ask him to change his name or his habits or the connections he belonged to before he found her. Instead, she made room for all of it. She understood that what mattered was not erasing his past, but allowing him to step into a future where he could finally choose for himself. For both of them, the first holiday season after the reunion was particularly significant. Emma placed a small ornament with the name Charlie on her modest Christmas tree, the same name she had whispered to herself every December since 2004. Caleb noticed it but said nothing, simply touching the ornament for a moment before stepping back. Later that evening, he handed her a framed photograph, him at the age of 3, taken by his adoptive family. He explained that he thought she should have a picture from the years she had missed. Emma held the frame with both hands, studying the image for a long while. She placed it beside the only photograph she had kept of him as a toddler, the two versions of her son now standing together for the first time. As winter turned to spring and the case files were formally closed, Emma found herself drawn less to the memories of the motel courtyard and more to the moments unfolding in the present. Caleb visiting on weekends, calling from Idaho, sharing the progress of his work and studies. She did not press him to move closer permanently, believing he needed to finish the journey he had begun long before he knew the truth. But she also understood that the time they now shared was something neither of them took for granted. It was a quiet understanding, one shaped by loss, but held together by the simple fact that they now had the chance to choose each other again and again. In early summer, Emma attended Caleb's university graduation ceremony. She sat among families cheering for their children, her hands folded neatly, her gaze steady on the figure walking across the stage. When Caleb accepted his diploma, he looked briefly toward her, and she nodded once, offering a smile that held no weight of the past, only recognition of the present. Afterward, they stood for a photograph, something ordinary, something that belonged to any other family on any other afternoon. Yet for Emma, it felt like a quiet arrival, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but settles gently, reminding her that closure sometimes comes not through answers, but through the chance to continue. That evening, as they returned to her home in Salem, she placed the graduation program beside the small box where she had kept reminders of Charlie since the early years of searching. The box no longer represented uncertainty. It had become a container of memory rather than longing. She closed it softly and left it on the shelf. When she stepped outside to water the plants along the walkway, she heard Caleb's voice from inside the house. And for a moment, she simply listened. It was a sound she had once feared she would never hear again, but now it belonged to her daily life. Emma understood that the years ahead would not erase what had happened. But she also understood that the path forward did not need to be shaped by loss. It could be shaped by presence, by continuity, by the simple act of showing up for one another. And in the quiet of that evening, with her son nearby and the past no longer silent, she allowed herself a thought she had not dared to hold for many years. Perhaps the story she had lived for 2 decades had finally reached a point where it could rest. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had found its way home. If this case made you think about how fragile a moment can be, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. You're watching from where today, and what detail stayed with you the most?